28. Thank you for all showing. Just a couple of organizational items before we go. There were some minutes of the November 17 meeting that I prepared, which Paul, I think you and I are going to be the only ones that can actually approve these. I was fine with these minutes. If you're all okay with these, then we'll just enter them in.
Yeah, I'm fine. I read them earlier today. Thank you, Tom.
Perfect. Okay, so those minutes are good, Diane. Thanks for that. So today's main purpose is to talk about the Hooker and Holcomb valuation as that relates to our ADAC. But I did want to just take a minute and make sure that Ellen and Robert understand that our committee, which is now myself, Tom, with Colin Dobbin, Amy, and James. So we have some really new people. I mean, let's just say that if I'm the more experienced one, you're in trouble. So, so the notion here is nothing is too simplistic. So don't worry about if you think, oh, they'll know about this. You should feel free to fill in around the details or provide context as necessary. There's a couple of different things on our agenda. I think you have the agenda, Diane, that you had passed around for, let's see, was that on your email today?
I know I sent it Friday and then maybe.
Yeah, so maybe it was Friday. Yeah, here it is.
It's been the 24th.
Yeah. So people.
It's really it's the actuarial valuation and maybe just a comment.
Yeah, so there's also on our agenda there's an item on our investment policy. Our investment policy, I suppose, is subject to being visited at any time by any member, but there's nothing that would require us necessarily. There's no timeline associated with this. It's just an issue has come up elsewhere, completely unrelated to the RPAC, and the thinking is perhaps we would do well to consider what, if anything, we feel that our investment policy might benefit or not from considering perhaps taking some action in that regard. I'll introduce that in a little bit, but the thing with investment policy is we may just tee that up, have a preliminary discussion, and then have that placeholder and continue the next time we meet. I think if we were to do anything, we would want to get that done by June. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah,
Right.
at the end of the fiscal year.
So again, there's enough about evaluation reports in ADAC to fill this meeting and perhaps even another one if we wanted. So I didn't want this investment policy issue on the agenda to crowd anything out. So anyway, with that said, I think I can turn it over to you, Ellen and Robert, and you can walk through the most recent report, which I think, Diane, you circulated today by email.
Correct.
That was an updated one? Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Final draft came through today.
Perfect. So if everybody has the one from Diane email midday today, we're good to go and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having us. I'm hoping that you can see what's on my screen.
It all looks good.
Can you see all the way to the bottom of the page?
No, it cuts at your name.
Okay. I may have to do this in a different way then. I apologize. Bear with me for 10 more seconds here. Okay, how about now?
Perfect. Great.
That looks good.
Great. Okay. Thank you for having us. This is just an overview of what we're going to go over. So it's going to be pension and OPEB. We did valuations for both this year. We'll go over what the purpose is, how the asset performance went for the prior year. Gains and losses related to liability. Basically an overview of what the results were, and same for OPEB. And then also for pension, we'll talk a little bit about investment return and the funded ratios. And then at the very end, if there's any questions, feel free to ask us. It doesn't have to be at the end. I know that there are a lot of people here that haven't been involved for a long period of time, so please interrupt us at any time. Okay, so just a basic level, what is the purpose of the valuation? There's a cost that gets incurred by the city. And so the main items here are, the whole purpose of a pension plan is to pay benefits to retirees. And so there's going to be basically a funding that occurs to cover this. So there's benefits, there's admin expenses that both get paid over the lifetime of the plan. A giant piece of this is that you expect that the trust is going to earn returns. There's going to be investment returns going to offset these costs. It's also a contributory plan, which means that active employees are paying into the plan. So the ultimate cost to the plan is the difference between these items. When we say ADEC, that's a fancy term for employer contribution. It's the actuarially determined employer contribution. There's two pieces to this. There's what occurred in the past, which is the unfunded liability. Unfunded liability is the difference between the liability and the assets in the trust. And that gets amortized depending on what the funding method is of the plan. And we'll go into that a little bit later. And then the normal cost, the assignment of benefits earned for the budget year. So what that means is there are active employees in the plan. It's expected that their benefits are going to grow over the upcoming year. And so this is the amount that's assigned to the liability growth for the upcoming year. So we looked at the assets for the past 12 months, ending on July 1st, 2022, or July 30th, 2022. New Canaan, it wasn't unique to New Canaan, but it was a tough year on a market basis. A loss of about 14%, and that's pretty typical of what we've seen. I've seen some that have been approaching 20% in the negative direction. For the most part, they've been within the 10 to 15% range in the wrong direction. However,
can you remind us what our positive return was for 20/21? Were we at 20 or something like that? Or it was a lot.
I believe it was about 25 or 26.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a,
Yeah, so on average, we're like up 6 in the two years combined, year over year.
absolutely, and I think Robert will get to this.
Yeah, that's fine, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, the smoothing aspect means that we're having a reasonable year fall off the 5-year average, and we're adding this horrendous year into that 5-year mix. But I think he'll get to that plot twist in a second.
Yes, that's actually the next thing I was going to go into. So the way that we come up with the assets for the plan is not on a market basis, but rather on an actuarial basis. So what we do is it's 5-year actuarial smoothing, which is the most popular that municipalities use. Gains and losses get smoothed 20% a year over 5 years. So for this year, 20% of the losses for 21 through 22 are being recognized. 40% of the gains or losses for the prior year are being recognized, etc. And over a 5-year period, they eventually make their way through. The nice thing about this is that instead of kind of bouncing all over the place like the market has done, you get this smooth transition, which is a lot easier to budget for. And so just to go into more detail on that. The market returns, obviously, they fell short of the 6.75 assumption that we're currently assuming for the plan's investment rate of return. Very typical for a municipality over that period of time. As we alluded to, there were gains the year before, so some of these losses were offset. So for the 5-year period, well, for the 1-year period, it was 6.6% for that fiscal year. Technically, that's a loss on assets because the assumption is 6.75, but we're not talking about a giant figure. Monetarily, it's approximately $0.3 million, which impacts the contribution negatively by about 32 grand. Are there any questions on this, or should I?
Okay, so you're saying the difference between the AVA return of 6.6 and our assumed 6 3/4 translates into this 0.3 million or 30, right?
That's correct. Yeah, that 0.15% in money terms, it would be these figures.
Yeah, so when that last bullet point says for the period, it's for the 5-year AVA period.
This is for just the 21 through 22 period, but the AVA is impacted by a 5-year history.
I see, yeah. That's what I meant.
I'm sorry, so what was the AVA for the prior year then? For 20 to 21?
So I can grab it from one of the pages here. So the AVA in 2021 was just shy of 158 million. It increased to 163.2 million. So it increased, but it did increase as quickly as was anticipated.
Okay, so the smoothing, the effect is this year doesn't look as bad as the actual losses, but last year doesn't look as good as the actual gains.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a smooth pattern.
Okay.
Yeah, and I went back and looked just since it was asked. The 1-year return as of June 2021 was 25.94% after fees.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we talked about assets. Now the other side of it is liabilities. So just high level, a liability is the present value of a person's future benefit, or for someone who's a retiree, they're already in payment status. It's the present value of what they're currently being paid. If everything happened exactly as expected, the liability gain and loss would be 0. That never happens, but if the assumptions are good, then you're going to stay reasonably close. So just examples of what would cause a gain or a loss. We have a salary scale assumption. We have a certain expectation for how salary is going to move. So pay might be higher or lower in reality than what we're expecting. We assume that people pass away, terminate, retire in a certain way. In reality, it could be more or fewer than that. So we expected that the 2022 liability was going to be 149.7 million. Luckily, there was a gain this year. In reality, the liability was $2 million short of that. So there was a gain of $2 million on liability. This is all related to participant experience. Biggest cause of this was mortality. Bad for them, but good for the city. There were more deaths than expected. And then another piece of this was that there were favorable retirement patterns. So the number of retirements and terminations impacted the plan in a favorable way. Are there any questions on this? Okay. Every 5 years, approximately, we do an experience study for the town. So we've got a ton of assumptions for how we think things are going to move. So we have mortality, retirement, termination, etc. We have rates in place that, based on experience, that we think are going to be what actually happens. As the 5 years pass, we take a look at them and see if that's actually what occurred, if we need to tweak anything, or if the ones in place make sense. So I'm just going to quickly go. I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
What does the recent SOA improvement scale?
Oh, I'm sorry. SOA stands for Society of Actuaries.
Thank you.
So each year, they come up with what's called a mortality improvement scale. There's a base table that assumes that at each age, male and female separate, people are going to pass away at a certain rate. So like, for example, at age 80, it might be 2% for a male, that kind of thing. There's an improvement scale that goes with that kind of assumes that people are living longer and it's going to improve over time. And so each year, generally each year, a new scale comes out. So the most recent scale that came out is MP 2021. So we added that to our assumptions.
And Robert, could you remind us of these particular factors? Do any one or more of them have any judgment associated with this? Or are the sort of demographic attributes of the town just plugged in and this is the result? In other words, this isn't a recommended outcome. This is what the formula yields.
So for something like mortality, you really need a giant sample size. So pension plans are not big enough generally to have an experience study done on their mortality, unless you're talking about somebody like Verizon or General Motors or somebody like that. Generally speaking, if the sample size is not that large, we use a standard table. So for mortality, this is the standard table, so we recommend that. Same with disability. There weren't many disabilities for the plan. Sample size of the group is not super large, so we're recommending a general table for that. But for something like retirement and termination, the rates that we are recommended are based on New Canaan experience, and same with the salary scale.
Hey, Robert, can I ask one really basic question? And
Sure.
Tom said I could ask dumb questions, but so
No,
this
go
is,
ahead.
this pension is for the defined benefit people. It's not for people now who come in and it's a 401(k).
401.
Right, so how many people does this cover? And of our current workforce, who is it the police and fire go into this? Is it limited to that?
And then whoever was grandfathered before, the new employees, plus some Board of Ed employees.
Okay,
I'm assuming custodians, non-certified.
This is-
They go in second.
yeah. So, yeah, I'd like to know how many people are in this assumption, but that's, continue with your analysis. I'm just curious how many folks we're covering here.
Sure. Ellen, do you happen to have that number handy?
Yeah, I just pulled it up. It's roughly around 280 people who are actively working for the town. But there's around 780 total people covered by it, meaning, they retired and they're collecting benefits, or they worked for the town, they left and they're still owed benefits at some point in the future. So it's more heavily weighted toward people not currently working there, but it's about 280 currently working people, if that makes sense.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so the sum of this page 8, Robert, is for a lot of non-financial reasons, the liability aspect of the overall formula you started with had a movement to, from the town's perspective, the positive of 485.
Yeah, as far as the employer contribution goes, the impact is $485,000 in the right direction.
Right.
The three biggest, if you're curious, disability had a big impact, salary scale had a big impact, and the marriage assumption. For the marriage assumption, we were assuming that 80% of people when they retire are married, but when we looked at the actual data, 70% was a better fit.
And just to add to why that matters so much. So when someone retires, their benefit is calculated according to a formula. If they are single, they'll receive that benefit for the rest of their life until they pass away. If they're married, they'll still get that same benefit for the rest of their life until they pass away. But then I think it's at least 50% of that, sometimes higher depending on the groups and what their salary was, continues on to their spouse. And that's just an automatic provision in the plan. So that's why that marriage assumption has such a big impact on the numbers, because if you know, fewer people are married, then that's less benefits that the town is paying out.
And in our plan, I mean, I know the plan that I have, you make an option. You can either take it, a higher benefit yourself, and it ends when it ends, or you can choose a lower benefit and then it goes to your spouse after. But in this plan, it automatically goes to the spouse. There's not a choice.
Yep, that's correct. And that's really typical of municipal plans to have that automatic benefit continue to a spouse. We see that a lot. That is not really something you see on the corporate side. It works more like what you just described, where if you want a continuation, then you pay for some of that. But on the muni side, it doesn't work like that very often.
So Ellen, I have a question. The pension is calculated at the time of retirement, right? As I understand it, we don't have a cost of living adjustment in our plans with the employees of the town, right? So it's set at a certain amount and it stays at that amount for their retirement. Is that right?
That is correct. I believe, and Diane can probably answer this better than I can. I believe in the past there have been some what they call ad hoc COLAs, meaning that, you know, the town kind of evaluates it and decides they're going to give a one-off increase to benefits. But I don't think that's happened in several years.
Yeah, my understanding is the last one was in 2007. I'm just wondering, with our comparable towns, do they have similar arrangements with their employees, or do more towns have automatic cost of living adjustments? What's your experience?
And Rob, you can chime in on the municipalities you work on. I've seen it kind of all over the place. Sometimes it's automatically given on police and fire. It's less often automatic on non-police and fire groups. I will say that the trend in negotiations has been to negotiate those automatic cost of livings out of the contracts. So where municipalities have been able to do that, they have done that for new hires, just get rid of that automatic adjustment. I have a couple of municipalities that they do this sort of ad hoc. You know, they look at it, review it every couple of years. Sometimes they'll give one, sometimes they won't. They are pretty costly. It's very costly to have it in your plan as an automatic thing. And then it's also costly to do a one-time increase. So I guess to answer your question, it's kind of all over the place, but I would definitely say the trend has been to remove it where they can. And Rob, I don't know if you've seen similar on plans that you work on.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. The big points that I'd agree with you are it's more common for police and fire. It's more common for older tiers. So it's kind of drying up. Like when you have a new tier, it's typically not offered. And ad hoc COLAs, I really don't see very often. We did a cost estimate for a town this year because of inflation being out of control, just to show what it would have been for a one-time ad hoc COLA. It was exorbitantly expensive and they decided not to do it.
Okay,
Well,
thank,
the circumstances in the last, 8 or 10 years must have been very favorable for towns to be able to negotiate it out, even if they had that, because people weren't terribly worried about inflation. If you were to say, well, how valuable is that to me in a year where, last 4, 5, 6, 8 years, there hasn't been any inflation, you probably could have easily leaned on people to give that up in exchange for something that was kind of more immediate under the nose, but, okay,
Yeah, it's a very good point.
okay.
So this is just a high level, showing what the valuation results are, under some different assumptions. So we did a valuation as of 2021. We're typically doing it, every 2 years, but we did, what's called an interim valuation for the plan in 2021. Rather than getting new data, as of July 1, 2021, we did basically a simplified process where we have the data as of 2020. Basically did what's called a roll forward to approximate the liability, and we combine that with the assets at the time. The reason that New Canaan had asked us to do this was because it was such a good year for assets. So bottom line, the ADEC for that year was just shy of $1.1 million. So now fast forward a year later, we've got our baseline assumption. So it's all the same assumptions as the year before. It's just new data and new assets. Next column, now we're bringing in the experience study assumptions. We're bringing in that mortality improvement scale I had alluded to. Still keeping it 6.75% for our investment return assumption. Next column, well, next 2 columns are just lowering the investment rate return assumption. So the baseline run resulted in ADEC of $671,000. Once we brought in the experience study assumptions, it made it go even lower, down to $187,000. And then as you decrease the discount rate assumption, it's going to make the ADEC go up, so you can see what it would be under these 2 scenarios. There's a lot of information on this page, so I'm happy to walk you through a specific scenario if you'd like.
Can you go under the July 1, 22 valuation? The first line is what's the before and after again? Just give me the before and after.
Sure.
That-
So, we ran the experience study. Our baseline run, our this column here, we're not putting the experience study assumptions in the analysis just yet. We want to see what it's going to be before. After we put them in, the liability goes down by what was it, 3.7 million.
Right.
I think another way to think of this, Amy, is,
When they adjust the assumptions, right?
yeah, so when you got to where they were on page 7, that got them to 147,
Right.
and then he adjusted all those assumptions.
Got it. Okay.
and
Thanks. That was
And then you can see as you decrease the discount rate, it's going to make the liabilities go up.
Right, so if you trim it by 1/8 and then by 1/4, that's causing, I guess, the assumed liabilities are going down and the assumed assets are staying the same across the scenarios of the various discount rates.
Right, yeah, you can think of it like a mortgage. If you're gonna refinance, you're gonna end up with a different amount for your payment. This is kind of going the opposite direction. The present value of the whole thing is going to be different if the payments don't change, but the interest rate is different.
Yeah, what you're.
Understood.
Are we at 675 then?
Yes.
And so I'll go into more detail on the next page related to this. I briefly talked about this before. The ADEC is made up of two pieces. There's the past and the future. The normal cost is for active employees, what's going to happen in the future. The amortization of unfunded liability is basically what was incurred in the past. So for the normal cost, we're going to show everything on a 6.75 discount rate basis because that's the current assumption. The total normal cost, the gross normal cost, which is what everyone has to pay, whether they're the employer or the employee, is 2.36 million. Because employees pay into the plan as contributory, it's expected that they're going to contribute from payroll about 0.65 million. And then there's also a small load that we have in there for admin expenses. So the net normal cost, what the city has to pay, is 1.78 million. So that's the normal cost piece of the ADEC. For unfunded liability, I briefly talked about this in the beginning, that it's kind of tied to a funding policy, and each municipality has a different funding policy. New Canaan has chosen to do a 15-year open amortization. And so I'm going to use the example of a mortgage again. Say that every year you take out a 15-year mortgage on your house. You don't pay it down, let me rephrase this. You pay it down, but you don't change the period. So it's not like a year from now, it's going to be 14 years. It's just going to be another 15-year amortization of a different amount, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Yep.
you just roll it.
And so currently assets exceed the liability by over 19 million. And what this amounts to with the amortization is a negative $1.6 million effect.
Right.
And so the positive normal cost and the negative unfunded liability gets you to the 187,000 that I showed on the other page.
And that's what the 1.9 is on the very next page, Robert. That's your 186, 187. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Now I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail. We saw this number already. This is the gross. This is what employees are putting into the plan. The plan pays admin expenses out of the trust. So we have something assumed in the normal cost to account for this. So it's about $65,000 for the past year. The straight 15-year amortization of that $19 million that you're overfunded is $1.94 million. But then there's this amortization adjustment, which Ellen is going to get into in a couple of slides, that kind of offsets this. Last piece is adjustment for interest. So we calculate this as of the valuation date, but you don't actually pay it until a year later, or 18 months later, I guess. Something like that. So there's a small interest adjustment. So here's your 187,000. Does anybody have any questions on that?
Nope.
Okay. I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
No, I think we're all set.
Oh, good, okay. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ellen.
Okay, thanks, Rob. So the last couple of slides we have here related to pension are kind of just some discussion around the investment return assumption that we use. We have this discussion every year when we run the valuation, you know, is 6.75 the right rate that we should be using? Should it be lowered? I don't think we've ever in my time on the plan talked about increasing the rate, but maybe someday that will come. This slide just shows it's information that Rob already gave to you, what your contribution would look like at different rate of return assumptions. And, the world and the markets are so volatile right now. I think we're hearing a lot of investment firms are actually increasing their capital market assumptions, which are in turn supporting higher rates of return on plans like this. I don't think we're sitting here saying, because of that, you can go up on the 675, but I also don't necessarily think, it depends a lot on your appetite for how conservative you want to be with things, what kind of is in your budget in terms of ADEC for 23, 24. But I think from an actuarial perspective, any of these numbers would fall within the range of reasonableness. So, I don't think we're going to sit here and tell you have to come down on it. I think we just wanted to kind of open it up to a discussion, see what you were thinking, what your investment advisors are saying, things like that. And then once we look at these slides, we also have some slides that just show statistics of what other municipalities are doing around the state of Connecticut. Again, just informational, absolutely not to say you need to do what they're doing, but a lot of municipalities like to see where they fall related to others. And you are within the range at 675 of what others are doing. So I guess I'll pause there and see if anyone has, thoughts on the investment rate of return and where your head is at, I guess, kind of related to that.
So
Ellen, I'm sorry.
When you say that it's falls in the range of reasonableness, you're saying this 675 falls within your sort of projections of 20, it falls between the 25th and 75th percentile kind of thing. It's right at the fat part of the bell curve. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, so when we look at it, again, from an actuarial perspective, we're signing this report as an actuary. So our duty here is to make sure that the assumptions you are using are reasonable from our perspective. So we're looking at it, these are long-term obligations. Hooker and Holcomb, we have an investment advisory group that puts out their own capital market assumptions. So we kind of run your investment allocation through our own firm's capital market assumptions. We look at information that you get from Vanguard. We sort of smush it all together, for lack of a better word, and come up with ranges of what we think is reasonable. So I think 675 is reasonable. It's probably the higher end of reasonable, but I would have no hesitation in signing a report saying that, I agree with this assumption. I have no concerns over it.
Yeah.
Ellen, can you refresh my recollection? Because this is, I think, my second year on this committee. What's the history? Have we been at 675 for a while now, or did we increase it to 675?
It was not increased. I think you've been at 675 for at least a few years. It was probably lowered from a higher rate. That's definitely been the trend. But I think it's been a few years you've been at 675.
Okay, as long as I've been on this committee, Colin, and I've been, I think, maybe 4 years.
Yeah.
And I think it was even, when I was here, it's extended back another 4.
Yeah.
Kind of felt, but.
It was lower than to that blended rate.
Yeah, so a couple things about this, number one, the fiduciary aspect of this, James and Colin, Amy, to me, job number one is do no harm, right? There's been a lot of years where we funded this when it was painful. There was a lot of years where we kind of funded this where it was perhaps somewhat easier, relatively speaking. And all of that discipline has got us to an enviable position of being overfunded, right? And, these 700, 800 individuals are relying on this in ways where it's hard to overstate the importance. And as a result, to me, we wouldn't want to, consider these changes in a way that would perhaps, I guess, unduly take into consideration short-term budgetary gains that perhaps might be available to us because we've had a year of some favorable inputs. Here, what we have is a horrendous financial performance, but these actuarial assumptions really kind of came in our favor this year. And when you put all that stuff together, it seems to have conspired into a year which is, pretty good, not nearly as bad as, the market returns for sure. And as a result, we now actually have some choices here, all of which are going to result in a year-on-year savings to the town. And so we come back and look at 6 3/4, from my perspective, the 187 seems unusually attractive, right? That's an alluring option to us when you consider we were times 10, a year ago. On the other hand, we had been considering in this committee for some time whether or not 675 was high, whether or not we couldn't, chip an eighth or more off of that when circumstances would otherwise allow. Because you have to kind of consider what is the real long-term investment horizon? All of these are going to fall within the realm of reasonable. So we have coverage for ourselves, depending on what we think. And I think it's a fair question to say, in this environment where you can get 2-year treasuries over 4, how much are people, going to be reaching for that next, 75 multiple tech company with no actual profits? You know what I mean? In other words, I wonder, I think Brian's on, he'll tell us the exorbitant deflation in the equity in the bond markets would suggest that there's less pressure on us to do anything on the 675 because there seems to be room for those things to come back, right?
Well, I mean, fixed income went from earning nothing, which is a big chunk of our portfolio, to having a decent return right now. Equities were crazy hot, they're not as hot, right?
So I don't know what the people think about this. I mean, it's only with 30,000 bucks to trim an eighth off this year. Of course, that would be a change which would be more expensive every year, but perhaps might, in the longer term, be a more realistic assumption of what we're looking at longer term. Bearing in mind that the 6 3/4 has been on the high side of the acceptable range for a number of years now. And we've always kind of said, well, you know what, I think I'm okay. Some of that may have been because to have trimmed it in a year where the 6 3/4 was $1 million, trimming an eighth or a quarter off would have been very expensive in a time where now we have these actuarial assumptions and other non sort of investment return considerations that are kind of all lining up in the town's favor. I'm not saying this is the year to do it, but if one were to consider doing it, this might be the year to do it, and it would only cost you 30,000 bucks to do it over leaving it alone. But again, I always come back to, my mantra is to do no harm here, and try to make sure that we're taking into account, what's really in the best interest of, participants and beneficiaries of these funds. I don't know, Brian, do you have a view on your firm's long-term investment return outlook?
Yes, and I can, in sum, it has a lot to do with everyone has been talking about, including how you summed it up, is only in the last few quarters, like this is the first time in a long time that our assumptions have gone up, our capital market assumptions. And that's because, before 2022, on the equity side, valuations were getting more and more expensive as those markets were running up. So we were lowering our forward-looking expectations for equity markets. And then, as was mentioned, prior to 2022, there was really little to no return coming from fixed income. And 2022, both of those reversed in the sense of equities became more reasonable. They still don't look cheap by our metrics, but just fair valued, whereas before they were overvalued, or at least US equities were. But fixed income is, you're now, forecasting a return that's, 100, 150 basis points higher than it was a year ago. So in some, it's the first time in a while that our capital market assumptions have come up. And so just this morning, I was able to send Diane what our 30-year projection under the current asset allocation is. And at the median, using our 12/31 forecast, it's 6.79%. So kind of like right on top of the 6.75. But you're right. Also, the trend the last few years was public plans, whether it's in Fairfield County or on a national basis, we're lowering that discount rate because of everything that I was saying that was happening before 2022. So at least as far as our 30-year assumptions, like right at the median, it just happens to be very close to that. And we always provide that distribution to kind of see that range of likeliness.
And so if we were to, well, let's just talk about what this committee's facing. So we need to pick one so we know which number to plug into the budget.
Right.
So we have a week or so if we were not prepared to make a final decision tonight.
Sure.
Ish.
But it's
I mean,
it doesn't cost you much to be more conservative here, what you're
Correct.
saying, this year, right?
Right.
This year.
And again, but yeah, just for the, and I think presumably it would be more expensive every year. But it is the more conservative approach.
Yeah, and if you're fundamentally protecting the asset, the plan is the most
Correct.
important thing. Yeah, I really quickly looked through, not that we should compare ourselves to our competitors, but I thought it was interesting. They're all incredibly well funded, but Fairfield and Greenwich, which are below 1 times, have the highest rates,
Yes,
690, because they're trying to make it up.
right.
But Darien's at 6.25.
Yep.
A lot of them have like 6.25 and are well funded. So
Well, and here's the other consideration that makes this decision this year somewhat different than the others. And so help me if my logic runs off the rails here, Alan or Brian or Robert. So the smoothing that we adopted last year, which is benefiting us after a horrendous market meltdown, the smoothing will necessarily cause us our actual returns to be tempered some, correct? So if in fact, if we keep the higher discount rate, the smoothing will always cause us to have to make a contribution, because the smooth return is going to be reduced from the actual return. So even if we have the good fortune of realizing very good market returns, the smooth return, because you have to take into account that awful year that's in the 5-year window, the smooth return is going to be less, so we're going to fall short of the 675 because of the smoothing.
yeah, you're having a 20% hit of that, right?
Right.
But also the year before that was huge.
Yeah, well, that's
So,
true. At some point that falls off, right?
Right, so it's like
Yeah.
a 20%, it's.
But it just strikes me that, right, if you have a return that's not equal to 675, there's a contribution on that side too. So if you were to chip an eighth off this year, then you might reduce the amount by which you need to be making a contribution, because your smooth return is less than your assumed return.
We have, I hate to interrupt, but we only have about 4 more minutes because
Okay.
we're gonna be kicked out.
We're gonna
of the
kick us off for the
meeting.
WPCA.
Yeah.
So let me just, Alan and Robert, is there anything we need to know about OPEB that is meaningfully different than what we've covered? Other than the actual numbers, no, are different, but
No, I don't think there's much to go through on the OPEB side. I guess the only thing that we would want to mention there is, and I think we talked about this a couple of years ago. So we developed the contribution on the OPEB side using the market value of assets. And you can see what happened on the pension side and how beneficial it is to be using that actuarial smooth value to smooth your contributions out from year to year. So I think we would probably recommend that we adopt that same asset method on the OPEB going forward. It's I mean, you know, it's a better year to do it when you had such big losses last year because it helps reduce the contribution this year. But going forward, you know, regardless of what happens in the market, whether you have big gains, it's just, it will help to smooth out the contribution from year to year. So I know we talked about that a couple of years ago, and then it was kind of put on hold because the market did so well from 20 to 21. So we said, okay, let's talk about it next year. So that's the only thing we wanted to point out on the OPEB side, was just, you know, making that change there as well.
What level of overhead funding are we? What percent funded are?
The funded ratio of the
Yeah.
Do you know what that is offhand, Rob? Do you have that number? I don't think we put it in our report here.
Oh, here we go.
it's 18.
Oh, it is there. Okay. Yep. So it's about 73.6%. This again is at 6.75. So I assume if you come down on the pension side, you probably would also bring the rate of return down on the OPEB side. So you might want to see those numbers before you make a final decision on the discount rates, and we can certainly run that.
Yeah, if you could run that and get them to Diane, then you can shoot them to us and we can be in a position of making some decisions there, but it probably makes some sense without the same smoothing.
You should. You're funded, you're well enough funded now that it makes sense to smooth it. You were catching up.
Yeah, that makes some
Yeah,
sense to me.
I've given them in the morning. All right, the only reason why I've done this is because if I go, no, if I'm in planning zone, they've got a huge meeting there, and gotta get into this and now. So you guys done? I can enter meeting, so.
Yeah, so, yeah, what we'll do is, Diane, we'll come back to you with anything else we need, or if we need to reconvene with your assistance. Well, this has obviously been very, very helpful, as it is every year, right? And again, because nothing is too basic for us. No, I almost. A lot of information, and thanks so much for bringing us back up to speed on all this. I guess, Coleman, James, through Diane, we'll kind of correspond by email and figure out how to take this to the next step and make the final decisions before we need to give Todd a number to plug into his budget.
Sounds good.
That will require us to do something in the next 10 days.
Thanks.
Okay, so.
Sounds good.
motions- All good?
Yep,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Okay,
Yep.
Brian.